we'll talk to people who now know more about Web3. I would invite Praphul Chandra on the stage. He's the founder of a startup called Koinearth. I don't know how many people know, he's actually the man who built the digital passport on MG's vehicles today. And there's, of course, Jaspreet Bindra, who his presentation introduced him. So I will not take much more time. We also have Suraj Aiar. He has joined us virtually. I hope you guys can all see him. Suraj runs a startup called Question What's Real. So the name, of course, goes with what he does. It's called QWR. Thanks for joining us, Suraj, as well. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.
You guys.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to actually start this panel with the simplest thing what Leslie just asked. What is Web3?
Yeah, I think the best way to understand Web3 is to kind of go back to the last 20 years and see what has happened, right? So if you just turn back the clock and go back and look at the web as it was in the 1990s. Basically what it was a bunch of companies or bunch of academic professors or universities putting out information that the average person could consume. And we call that Web 1.0 or the read web, where you could read content which was published by a very few people. Fast forward to the 2000s, and the big change was what we call Web 2.0, right? And most of us don't realize it, but there was a huge thing that Web 2.0 enabled, which is that you could tweet, or you could put a Facebook post, or you could put something on Instagram. And we called it the read-write web, which means that the average person could not only read the content put out by a select few, but they could also write content. In other words, this was also called user-generated content. And the reason it is important is because fortunes and companies were built with the read-write web, whether it's Instagram, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Twitter, right? All of these companies are built based, or YouTube, based on user-generated content. And what is happening now is what we call Web 3, which we call is the read, write, own web. And that single word, ownership, I think is the big idea in Web 3. Can you register ownership of physical objects, of digital objects, of data, of intellectual property on the web? And that ownership can be transacted as seamlessly as data is today. So for me, that really is the big differentiator of the read-write-own web.
Jaspreet, if I can.
No, brilliant. So read-write and read-write-own, I think, is the best way to think about the evolution. Two more things I would add to what Praphul said. So while these are in some sense, the sequence or the history, the 5 things that define Web3, in many ways, one of which he already mentioned. So one is that it's owned. And by owned, it means that, you can actually, using currency, using other artifacts, you can actually, rather than large companies owning it, users can own pieces of the web rather than Facebook owning it, or Twitter owning it, or Google owning it, number one. Number two, it's open. So what that means is mostly written on open source. Algorithms are mostly transparent. What in the earlier panel, this big Elon Musk Twitter thing about open algorithms, etc. So that's the second. The third is that it's trustless. So trustless doesn't mean there's no trust or less trust. Okay, what it means is that you don't need a trusted authority. And therefore, a big company which has which has just become a trusted authority, pretty much like cryptocurrency, blockchains, etc. It's kind of everyone trusts it. The fourth thing is it's ubiquitous. It's all over, and by that it means it's not only human web; it's also a machine web. In many ways. And there's a fifth thing which I always forget, so I've written it down. Is that it's permissionless. Today, actually, you don't think about it. You need Twitter's permission. You need Facebook's permission to do something. Otherwise, they can take you off. And this, for better or for worse, becomes permissionless. So these 5 things define Web3. And the last thing that I would say is that to me, in many ways, I look at Web3 as a business model. The Web 1 had a different business model. It was a publishing business model, like a magazine or a newspaper. Web 2 had a data-based business model. And Web 3 will have a much more user, individual, talent, and payments-based business model, and we can perhaps talk about it as we go through this conversation.
Yeah. Suraj, when I throw this to you, you run a startup called Question What's Real, right? What is the difference between Metaverse and Web3? That's what you're doing, right? How does Web3 and Metaverse differ?
Thank you for that question. So I'd like to add 10 cents to what our fellow gentleman just said, and then transition the conversation towards what we are up to, right? So what you guys need to understand is the internet in general is going to evolve from a 2D form factor to a 3D form factor, right? Now this 3D form factor really requires a visual interface that is way beyond a smartphone in general, because it's still going to give you only 2D information. So when you say metaverses, the three parallels that run side by side in order to enable something called a metaverse is basically a 3D web, which is a 3D internet in general, meaning websites are now going to be in 3D, like you can actually enter a website and, walk around it and then check out stuff rather than having to just scroll and tap on screens. The second part is the blockchain element, which basically allows every transaction and everything to be anonymized as well as logged in a centralized repository, which is shared amongst pretty much everybody, hence being decentralized. And the third thing is what we are working on, which is basically augmented and virtual reality computers, which are basically the future of your computers in general, right? It is a matter of fact that irrespective of whatever you're going to do, you are going to wear computers on your head, whether you like it or not. And fortunately or unfortunately now, with the advent of Web3, the adoption curve of AR/VR devices in general is now peaking up. So the 10 cents that I wanted to add was that AR and VR basically enables Web3 in a more immersive manner so that people can consume better, right? And lastly, what I would like to say is 4G is already allowing you to consume pretty much all of what the internet is able to offer you today. So what are we going to do with 5G and what are we going to do with that bandwidth, right? What we're going to be able to do with that bandwidth is when we adopt technologies like Web3, blockchain, and AR, VR together, that's when 5G will really be exploited to its whole, and the actual utility of 5G can be realized.
Got it. But to that point, 5G is yet to come, at least in countries like India. But we already have some implementations of Web3 that are happening. Let me start with you again, Praphul. What are these implementations? Where do we see Web3 at work already?
So I think the first places that we are seeing Web3 take off is in the blockchain space, right? Primarily because it is the fabric on which ownership is built. Now, the last decade was focused on cryptocurrency, which you think about is ownership of currency in some sense. What we are seeing this year is NFTs or non-fungible tokens coming out in a big way, right? And I think that will be the second leg of how you establish ownership in Web3. Simply put, an NFT is a certificate of ownership, right? Now, most of the focus today on the web is about using these certificates to register the ownership of digital art, right? But very quickly, we are going to see this to evolve to certificate of ownerships of intellectual capital, copyrights, of physical objects like cars and land records, and then certificates of ownerships of what we call human capital. Can you actually invest in a person's future revenue potential, right? So this whole idea is coming to terms, right? So NFT platforms are basically trying to take different asset classes and convert them into capital so that they can be collateralized, borrowed against, crowdfunded, and so on and so forth.
So all of these, other decentralized applications like Discord, for example, okay, which is a decentralized Twitter in many ways. And so there are these bits and pieces. But I think in my mind, at least the biggest Web3 implementation, application, whatever we call it, is what is also referred to as the creative economy or the passion economy. Where basically what it means is In some sense, gig work, what we call the gig economy, is a symptom of the passion or the creative economy. And it's very important. It's actually life-changing. It's certainly work-changing, but also life-changing. Because what it really means is that unlike earlier Web 2 world, where you monetized a collective, which was organizations, okay, now you monetize individuality. So which means that if you write well, rather than going and becoming a part of a collective, which could be Hindustan Times, okay, you could actually do this in certain Web3 sites, okay, Medium, for example, Substack, for example, and earn money. If you were an artist and rather than going to an art gallery collective, you could actually do the whole NFT thing that he spoke about, okay. Similarly, if you had other talents, which I won't talk about, you can go to OnlyFans, okay, which is another Web3 application in some sense. And this is massive because this is changing work and in some sense bringing the future of work to where it is. And this passion economy, creative economy, which will basically mean that as our children grow up, they're not going to be looking at joining Microsoft or joining Google. They're going to be looking at how they monetize their own talents. And Web3, through all the things that he mentioned, or you mentioned, you know, the whole crypto as a currency, NFTs as a rendering, the whole atmosphere, there will actually make that happen. I also do want to end with one simplistic thing. You know, you talked about the metaverse and what is the difference between metaverse and Web3. Different things, but the way I like to simplify it is that the metaverse in many ways is like the UI of Web3. Okay, it's a different user interface, and you know, then it means many other things. So back to you.
Yeah, I sort of envision it as how, I don't know how correct this is, but how we experience Web 2 through browsers, we'll experience Web 3 through Metaverse. Suraj, let me come to you. You always tell me, whenever I tell him that, you know, these are emerging technologies, he says they're not emerging, they're already here. So Suraj, you tell me where this is being implemented.
Well, in terms of Web3, like we like to see it in, for example, like let's take a use case of our own firm, right? We have had students in India, in remote parts of India, getting like quality education using virtual reality headsets. Now, this headset now is able to directly be transported to a child's house. While the child is wearing the headset, the teacher is able to understand if the child is focused. The child is able to provide any sort of input, and all of this is anonymized and stored on a blockchain system, right? So only the parent as well as the student has access, and anytime any person other than these people are able to access or wish to access this information, they are notified and permission is asked, and only then this particular information is provided. Now, this has been happening for over 3 years, and there are like over 10,000 students in India who have transitioned from, say, a first standard to a second standard or a fourth standard to a fifth standard without the need of a textbook. So the point was, previously I had a textbook, and I used to scribble in my textbook or take notes in my textbook, right? But then a teacher cannot really evaluate if the scribbling that I have done on a textbook has any value. But then when all the inputs that a child is doing inside of this metaverse that we have created inside the headset, right? The teacher is actually able to assess organically if the child has actually, focused on the intent and the child's intent is actually true. Now, what you also need to understand is it's not, the school curriculum in general is a very centralized one. But what we have noticed is that children have different sorts of skill sets and their characteristics and personalities are very different, right? So if a child is say for example, a child is very creative in nature, how he goes through or she goes through a science curriculum, right, is very different than a child who actually wishes to interact in a scientific manner with and wants to build a career in the scientific industry in general. But for example, a science textbook in general, if I take any diagram and I just try to doodle on top of it, right, a science teacher might look at it in a bad way, but an art teacher will look at it in a good way, right? A system that allows all of this to be consolidated in one place and allows random stakeholders to actually look at it from a holistic point of view, allows this child to really prosper very quickly. And then coming back to Praphul and Jaspreet's point of individuality, that individuality is now secured, and it is secured in a very organic manner because it is data driven. Previously, it was opinion driven, or it was basically a validation that comes out of another human whether they like me or whether they don't like me, the biases that come in general human decision making, all those really get deprecated, and real intent is directly valued when it comes to, you know, adoption and providing the security that a child needs for becoming an individual self.
Let me come to the core idea of what this summit is, right? AI. So far, whenever we speak, we've been told that there are data centers, data is going there, centralized, we are doing processing there, that's how AI works. But if we are decentralizing the internet, what's the link between AI? What does AI do in that case? How does it work?
So I think, again, let me give you two examples, right? Instead of talking abstract things. One which you can see and which is behind the scenes. So the first example I'll give you is, we have an NFT platform, and Make My Trip, which I'm sure everybody has heard of, launched NFTs on our platform. But how they did it was, they engaged with travel bloggers, the gig economy. They took the photographs taken by travel bloggers in 10 different cities like Goa, for example, and they fed it to an AI algorithm. And that AI algorithm generated artwork, right? It generated artwork based on those photographs taken from travel bloggers. And that digital art was sold as an NFT. So that's something that you can see. Now I'll tell you something behind the scenes, right? We talk about anonymity in Web3, but anonymity is also a challenge, because compliance requires you to make sure that there is no fraud. Now, if you can imagine the web of transactions on Web3, where things are being transferred from one person to another, you need to be able to detect fraud and to mine this transaction graph and red flag fraudulent transactions is something that companies, for example, like Chainlink are doing to say that this is a fraudulent transaction and red flag it, or saying this wallet address is potentially fraud. So that's something that you don't see, but AI behind the scenes in Web3.
That's behind the scenes. Okay. So I'll be quick. We do love mashing up technologies, you know, to see what happens. But two ways, again, as he mentioned two things, I'll quickly mention two things. Please, you know, AI is a horizontal, ubiquitous technology. It's like electricity. You only know when it's not there. Okay, but otherwise we don't even know that it's kind of doing stuff. And so in many ways, much of the foundational grunt work of making current and new and future Web3 systems work is going to be driven by AI. I mean, think about it. See, the good thing about centralized systems is that they are simpler and it's far more efficient. Okay, the moment you decentralize, while it's all very nice, okay, it becomes very, very, the work involved is much, much higher. The energy involved, etc., is much higher. And to optimize that, to make that work pretty much like electricity, okay, AI will be running all or most of it to make it happen in a optimized, efficient manner. So, you know, it's just at that level. The second part, quick one, is that, look, AI feeds on data. And data so far has been coming from all these Web2-based, at least personal data, Web2-based websites that we have. And now with Web3, you know, because it's owned, data is going to be owned by the users. Plus there's going to be data which is going to be generated by all the machines, ubiquitous, okay? And again, the whole nature of AI would change, and it would be AI which would be kind of powering all of that. So it's very difficult to say what, because it's, if this hotel runs on electricity, so does the next one.
Suraj, let me come to you, but as you heard the gong, we have to end this soon. So I want to sort of go around this room and say, how far are we from this? How is this I know you keep saying it's not the future, but how far are we from realizing this?
We aren't that too far, but then, you know, when you say like decentralization of the internet in general, like according to me, if I have to compare that to something else, like the only thing I can think of which I can compare that to is pretty much building like a self-sustaining society on Mars, right? The problem of decentralizing something that has already been centralized is going to be that tough a challenge as much as a challenge that probably a guy like an Elon Musk is foreseeing in the future. So that's probably how difficult it is. But then we are on a steady curve, and as many people try and get into the game and try to push the wheel forward, I think that we would be, it's just a decade away. Like if you want to quote me on something.
Praphul, let's get.
I'll break it down into two parts. I think the technology is here, ready to go. I think for 18 to 30-year-olds, it is being adopted as we speak. And for the rest of the population, it is for them to follow.
Before you answer, this is also, I mean, you are in Singularity, which is looking at, sort of a different level of future you guys think of, right? I want you to answer from that perspective. Where is that future? I mean,
you made it very simple for me now. Okay, 2039. Well, that's what is supposedly the latest date of Singularity, unless Leslie corrects me. Okay, which is when AGI, artificial intelligence, becomes more smarter. But look, the only thing I would say is, and Singularity also probably says that it's not we're not going to wake up in the morning and be in the Web3 world. Technology doesn't happen, or change doesn't happen that way. It's going to be by dribs and drabs. Okay, small little things happening, the way all of us have been talking about it happening here and then happening somewhere else and then happening somewhere else. And even as we are in Web 2 world, there's still the Web 1 part. Lots of it's still there. And so it's not going to just like transition. But over the next few decades until 2039 is when it's going to happen.
Got it. We of course imagined Web3 we imagined the Metaverse in 1964. We coined the term in 1992, and here we are sort of starting at it. Thanks a lot, guys, for joining us here. We'll end this panel here. Back to you, Leslie.